Welcome to our channel. Tonight, we are going somewhere that probably feels familiar the moment I mention it. Somewhere with wide streets and neatly painted mailboxes at the end of every driveway. Somewhere with the smell of percolating coffee drifting through a screen door at 5 in the morning, and a distant sound of neighbor's lawnmower cutting through the Saturday afternoon heat. Somewhere where the hedges are trimmed, the sidewalks are swept, and there is, at most hours of the day, the very reasonable possibility that someone nearby is baking something. We are going to America, the America of the 1950s. The most photographed, most advertised, most mythologized decade in the history of American domestic life. And if your very first instinct, upon hearing that, is to picture the way old television shows taught you to picture it, with a smiling woman in a frilly apron, handing her husband a perfectly golden brown casserole at precisely 6 o'clock in the evening, while wearing full makeup and pearl earrings in the middle of a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon, with children who are playing cheerfully in the background, instead of arguing about whose turn it is with the toy, then, congratulations, you have absorbed, with impressive thoroughness, exactly the mythology that the 1950s was extraordinarily good at producing. Here is the thing about mythology, though. It is almost always built on a foundation of something real, something lived, something that happened in actual kitchens, in actual bodies, on actual mornings when the alarm went off and the floor was cold and there was a family to feed before anyone else in the house had even begun to consider being vertical. The everyday woman of 1950s America was not assembled from magazine advertisements and television scripts. She was a human being navigating a particular and specific set of social expectations, economic realities, physical demands, and cultural pressures that would genuinely surprise most people today. Some of what she did every single morning would strike a modern observer as completely unnecessary. Some of it would appear almost heroically disciplined, and some of it, looked at carefully in the right light, was quietly extraordinary in ways that nobody at the time was especially encouraged to discuss out loud. Tonight, we are going to follow her through a complete day. One ordinary, typical, entirely unremarkable day in the life of an American woman in the 1950s. And I promise you that by the end of it, you will never look at a box of pin curls or a can of frozen orange juice concentrate quite the same way again. Before we begin, though, if you're enjoying this channel and these slow, unhurried walks through history, please consider hitting the like button. It genuinely helps more people find their way here. And if you would like to become part of a growing community of people who fall asleep to the quiet hum of the past, please subscribe. There is always something worth dreaming about. I would also love to know where you are watching from tonight. Drop your city, your country, or simply a hello in the comments. There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing that people from all over the world are settling in for the same quiet journey through the same ordinary history. Now, go ahead and dim the lights. Find the most comfortable arrangement your body and your blanket can agree on together. There's absolutely no rush. History has been waiting a very long time already, and will not mind waiting another moment while you get settled. Let the morning begin. It is not yet 5 o'clock. The sky outside is a particular shade of nothing that exists for approximately 40 minutes before the first gray edge of dawn decides to show up. The neighborhood is quiet in a specific way that only a residential street in the small hours manages. Not silent exactly, because there's always something, a dog somewhere, the distant passage of a truck on the highway 2 miles away, the settling of a house that has been sitting on its foundation since 1948 and has formed opinions about the overnight temperature, but quiet in the sense that the human world has not yet resumed its regular operations. You are already awake, not because the alarm went off. It is set for 5:15, and that small round clock on the nightstand, the one with the 2 bells on top, that look like little metal ears, will ring in approximately 15 minutes. But you are already awake, and you have been for a few minutes, and you are not surprised by this. Your body made this arrangement sometime in the first few years of marriage and motherhood, negotiating quietly with your nervous system, and arriving at a settlement that involved waking up before anyone asked you to. The body, in its pragmatic way, had simply calculated that 5:15 meant getting up in a hurry, and getting up in a hurry meant the day started wrong, and the day starting wrong was a problem that could be avoided by waking up first. So you wake up first. You lie still for about 30 seconds. Not because you are reluctant to move, though the bed is warm and the sheets have the specific quality of warmth that only happens when a person has been in them for several hours and the heat has distributed itself evenly across the entire surface, which is one of those deeply ordinary pleasures that nobody talks about enough. You lie still because there are a few things to think about before the day begins moving. The children's lunches, whether the bread is still sufficient for sandwiches, or whether you need to add it to the list. The dentist appointment that needs confirming. The church committee meeting. These are not anxious thoughts. They are more like a brief inventory check conducted by a very organized mental supply chain. The checklist runs. Items are confirmed or flagged, and then you get up. The floor is cold. This is essentially guaranteed. In the winter months, the floor is substantially cold, the kind of cold that is specifically calibrated for the soft, warm bottom of foot that have been under a blanket for 8 hours. Even in the fall or early spring, the overnight temperature of most 1950s American homes dropped meaningfully because thermostats were turned down at night. Heating fuel cost money in 1953, and money was accounted for, and turning the thermostat down at night was one of those small economies that had been absorbed into the structure of the household without anyone ever making a formal decision about it. It was simply what you did. Radiant floor heating, which keeps floors at a consistent and comfortable temperature, was essentially non-existent in the residential homes of this era. Baseboards and furnace systems heated the air, not the surface you stood on. So the floor delivered its morning message to the soles of your feet, and you accepted the message, and you moved anyway. You put on your robe and your slippers, and you go downstairs. The house at 10 minutes to 5 in the morning has a quality that it will not possess again for the rest of the day. It belongs entirely, absolutely, and exclusively to you. The living room is undisturbed. The sofa cushions are still in the arrangement you put them in last night, plumped and aligned, because you always do that before bed. The coffee table has nothing on it except the glass coaster and the lamp. The kitchen is spotless because you cleaned it last night after dinner, as you do every night, as every night requires. And the result is a room that looks exactly as though a very competent person has been maintaining it, which is the accurate situation. There are no shoes in the hallway. You pick those up before bed. There is no cereal box left open on the counter. You put that away. The dish drying rack is empty because everything was dried and put away before sleep. Because a dish drying rack left full overnight occupies counter space and constitutes an unfinished task. And unfinished tasks have a way of accumulating into a general atmosphere disorder that is significantly harder to address once it has achieved critical mass. The kitchen is yours. The house is yours. For the next 40 to 50 minutes, before anyone else wakes up, you are simply a person rather than a function. The percolator is already set up from the night before. This is one of those invisible rituals, the kind that you perform so automatically and so reliably that you would have to think deliberately about it to explain it to someone else, the way you'd have to think about breathing to explain it. Last night, before you went upstairs, you rinsed the coffee basket, measured the ground coffee into the filter, filled the base with exactly the right amount of water, and set the whole thing on the back burner of the range, ready to be lit. This preparation, which takes about 4 minutes in the evening, saves you from doing the same 4 minutes in the morning in a state of pre-caffeine functionality, which is not a state in which fine motor operations should be undertaken without supervision. You turn the burner under the percolator to medium-low and stand there while it begins its work. The percolator, for anyone who has only ever met coffee through a drip machine or a pod system, works on a principle that is elegant in its simplicity. Water in the base heats up, travels through a vertical tube, and rains down to the coffee grounds, picking up flavor as it passes through, and returns to the base, where the process repeats with increasingly coffee-infused water until the result has reached the desired strength. The whole operation takes between 8 and 12 minutes depending on the quantity, and it announces its progress with the sounds of liquid activity, a burble, a rhythm, a gradual intensification, that function as a kind of domestic countdown clock. When the burbling reaches its peak, the coffee is ready. American coffee culture in the post-war decade was genuinely serious. The United States was consuming somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 pounds of coffee per person per year by the mid-1950s, making it by a considerable margin the largest coffee-consuming nation on earth. The major brands, Folgers and Maxwell House and Hills Brothers and 8 O'Clock from the A&P grocery chain, were as familiar and as expected in any kitchen as the salt shaker on the table. Percolated coffee bore essentially no resemblance to what a specialty coffee establishment today would recognize as a beverage, but the function it served was identical. It was hot, it was caffeinated, it was habitual at 5 in the morning in a quiet house with the outside world still dark. It was perfect in ways that have nothing to do with flavor notes. The coffee comes out dark and strong. You pour it into a ceramic mug, one of the set you had since the early years of the marriage, which is slightly chipped on one ear, but serviceable in all the ways that matter, and you stand at the window over the kitchen sink. Outside, the street is still dark. The elm trees that line the sidewalk, which the neighborhood planted along with the houses in the late 1940s as part of the general optimism of new construction, have grown large enough now to be significant presences in the night sky. A car moves through the intersection at the end of the block, its headlights drawing a slow arc across the kitchen ceiling. A dog barks twice somewhere to the west, and then thinks better of it. This is the first quiet pleasure of the day. The mug, the warmth through the ceramic, the window, the particular caliber of stillness that belongs to the world before it wakes up. It lasts exactly as long as it lasts, which is sometimes 10 minutes and sometimes 20, depending on the morning and the children's internal clocks. And then it is over and something else begins. Today, that something else begins with the sound of a small child walking down the hallway, which is a particular sound of a child who has not yet learned to modulate their footsteps and is therefore stomping with the confident force of someone who does not yet understand that other people are sleeping. The morning has begun. But before you deal with a child, there is something you must attend to, because a day in a 1950s household begins for the woman of the house with an act of personal preparation that has been so thoroughly normalized by culture and repetition that you do not experience it as a requirement so much as simply the first part getting ready. You need to do something about your hair. Here is what your head looks like at 5 in the morning, before any of the children get involved. Your hair is up in pin curls, secure with metal clips, and covered with a light cotton scarf tied at the front. This arrangement, which you applied with practice efficiency last night before bed, has been the status of your hair for approximately 7 hours. The curls themselves are intact, or mostly intact, assuming you did not sleep exclusively on one side of your head to the entire night, which is the kind of thing that requires a certain specialized relationship with your own sleeping positions that you have, through years of repetition, developed. Pin curls were the primary hair setting method for the majority of American women who could not afford regular salon visits, which in the 1950s was effectively most women. The alternative was sleeping on rollers, which are cylindrical foam or wire cylinders that produce a rounder curl, and which have the additional quality of being significantly more uncomfortable to sleep on than pin curls, which themselves are metal clips applied to the scalp and are therefore not, by any objective measurement, a relaxing sleeping experience. The process of getting into pin curls is itself a procedure. You begin with hair that is either freshly washed and slightly damp, or hair that has been lightly dampened with a setting lotion sprayed from a bottle or applied with a brush. Setting lotion in the 1950s was a product that came in bottles with optimistic names and pink labels, and it smelled of a particular combination of alcohol and floral that defines the era's beauty products. It stiffened the hair slightly as it dried, providing the scaffolding that will hold the shape through the night and into the next morning's comb out. Then you take a small section of hair, approximately the width of 2 fingers, and wind it in a flat spiral against the scalp. When you reach the end of the section, you fold the tail of the hair into the spiral and secure the whole thing with a metal clip designed specifically for this purpose. The clip closes over the curl with a satisfying snap. You release it. It holds. Then you take the next section. For a full head of pin curls, you repeat this process between 40 and 60 times, depending on the thickness of your hair and the size of your curl sections. This takes, if you are experienced, approximately 25 to 35 minutes. If you are not yet experienced, it takes longer. If you have very thick hair, it takes longer regardless. The sets done by women who were genuinely practiced at this had a precision and a regularity that amounted to a craft. Each curl the same size, the same tension, laid in the same pattern across the scalp, so that when they came out the next morning, the waves and curls fell in exactly the right directions. This is what you are now reversing. You pull the scarf off your head and begin removing the clips, working from the back of the neck forward and setting each clip into the small dish on the bathroom counter where they live. The curls spring out as each clip is removed, Tight spirals that have been held in this position by the laws of physics and a night's worth of body heat. When all the clips are out, you look like someone who has recently lost an argument with a spring. This is fine. This is exactly how it is supposed to look at this stage. Now you brush. The brushing of pin curls out into their final form is a process that requires a light hand, a particular technique, and knowledge of your own hair's behavior that you have developed through years of experience. You do not brush aggressively. You work from the front, smoothing the curls into waves, guiding the shape of the bristles rather than forcing it. The brush of this era was typically natural bristle, boar bristle being preferred type for this work, because synthetic bristles of the 1950s did not behave the same way and could disrupt the set rather than smooth it. The wave emerges, the soft, rounded shape that the 1950 silhouette required. Not a rigid helmet of hair, but controlled softness that sat above the face with the appearance of effortlessness and which required, as you now know in significant personal detail, a very great deal of effort indeed. The irony of this particular requirement, that the finished result should look as though it happened naturally when in fact required nightly preparation, daily maintenance, and a set of skills passed down between generations of women, is a kind of irony that the 1950s era perfected across multiple areas of domestic life. A light spray of finishing product, not hairspray in the heavy lacquered scents that would become common by the late 1950s and reach its fullest expression in subsequent decades. Something lighter, luster cream, perhaps, or a finishing rinse. The purpose is to smooth any remaining flyaways and hold the shape through the morning without adding so much product that the hair loses its natural movement. You look at the result in the bathroom mirror. It is, by any objective measure of the era's standards, correct. The hair, in 1950s American social life, was not a personal preference. Or rather, it was a personal preference expressed within such narrow parameters that the range of acceptable variation was not large. The post-war silhouette required a specific shape for the head, a rounded, controlled, groomed shape that complemented the full skirts and the nip waist clothing of the era. Photographs from this period show an almost uniform softness to women's hairstyles across class and regional backgrounds. The specific waves and curls varied. The underlying commitment to order and presentation did not. Historians of American beauty culture, including Kathy Pice in her book, Hope in a Jar, which examined the beauty industry and its intersection with American women's culture across the 20th century, have documented how thoroughly beauty practices in the 1950s were understood as social obligations rather than individual choices. The well-groomed appearance, hair and face and clothing working together, was legible to other women, to neighbors, to the women's magazines, as evidence of a particular kind of competence and respectability. A woman who appeared with messy, unstyled hair in a public setting, including, by the standards of the time, the semi-public setting of the grocery store or the school pickup, was understood, through the subtle but consistent social grammar of the era, to be letting something slip. Letting things slip was not encouraged. You dry your hands. You turn to the medicine cabinet. Because now it is time for the other half of the morning preparation, the part that involves brushes of a smaller kind and colors that the natural human face does not produce entirely on its own. The medicine cabinet in a 1950s American bathroom was a revealing document, not a literal document, not full of letters and diaries, but material record of the specific beauty standards and health practices of the moment, arranged on small glass shelves behind a mirrored door. You open yours. Foundation first. This is the rule, the sequence that is so thoroughly internalized that doing it in any other order would feel as wrong as putting on your shoes before your stockings. The foundation of the 1950s was a different substance from most modern formulations. It was thicker, more opaque, produced in a range of shades that, by the standards of later decades, was not particularly diverse, but within the range it covered thoroughly. Pancake by Max Factor, introduced in 1938 and by the post-war years one of the most recognizable products in American drugstores, was applied with damp sponge and produced that characteristic smooth complexion that appears in every photograph from this era. The effect was not naturalness. The effect was presented composed skin, the complexion as a surface prepared for the day's activity, rather than the face simply as it was. There was a genuine reason for this preference beyond aesthetics. The combination of facial foundation and setting powder, correctly applied, created a remarkably durable surface that could withstand several hours of activity without requiring significant touch-ups. The woman who would spend her morning cleaning the house, managing the children, going to the grocery store, and possibly attending a PTA meeting or a church committee gathering needed her face to perform consistently across all of those environments. A lightweight modern tinted moisturizer would not have survived the first 45 minutes of this program. The thick, set foundation of the 1950s could go much longer. You apply it with your fingertips, pressing and blending across the forehead and down the sides of the nose and across the chin, where foundation has always had a tendency to collect in the fine lines of skin and require careful attention. Then the neck blended down to the edge of the collar, so that there is no visible line of demarcation between your prepared face and your unprepared throat. The neckline was a particular vanity point of 1950s beauty advice. Women's magazines of the era periodically reminded their readers that the neck needed attention, not just a face, because it was often the first place where age announced itself, and because it was visible at the collar and neckline of most women's clothing. Loose powder next, in a shade that matches the foundation. You apply it with a large puff, pressing it into the foundation rather than sweeping across, because sweeping creates streaks and pressing sets the foundation more effectively. The powder compact of the 1950s was a pleasant object to handle, typically round, with snap clasp and a mirror on the inside of the lid, and a puff secured under the lid or resting on the powder cake. The powder itself smelled of talc and of something floral, a smell that was so consistently present in the beauty product of the era that it became essentially the smell of getting ready. Then the eyebrows. The eyebrow standards of the 1950s occupied a specific position in the spectrum of brow aesthetics. Not the extremely thin, highly arched line of the 1930s, not the strong, fuller brow that would become fashionable in later decades, but middle road, shaped and defined with a gentle arch, frequently colored with a pencil to add definition that plucking alone did not always provide. The process of plucking and then drawing the brow back in with a pencil sounds, when ascribed to anyone who did not grow up with the practice, like a form of elaborate self-contradiction. But it was, within the logic of the era's beauty culture, entirely sensible. You removed the natural hair that did not conform to desired shape, and you replaced it with a drawn line that did. Efficiency through the medium of eyebrow pencil. Mascara. The application of mascara in the 1950s predated the modern wand applicator, which would not become the standard delivery mechanism for mascara until later in the decade, when Maybelline introduced the brush wand in 1960. In the early years of the decade, mascara was more commonly a cake product in a small rectangular case, applied with a wet brush. You wetted the brush, rubbed it into the cake, and applied it to the lashes with small strokes, working from the roots outward. The result, when done correctly, was a definition and darkening of the lashes that opened the eye. When done incorrectly, or when the mascara was slightly too wet or the application slightly too heavy, the result was a small black smear below the eye that needed to be addressed with a corner of the tissue. The lipstick was last. This was also a rule, like the foundation going first, because lipstick could smear, and if you applied it before doing anything else that required your hands near your face, you would simply need to reapply it afterward. The lipstick of the 1950s was not nude. It was not attempting to be invisible. The prevailing shade was red, or a deep coral or rose, the specific variety depending on skin tone and personal preference within a fairly narrow range established by what was fashionable. Revlon's Fire and Ice, introduced in 1952 with an advertising campaign that asked American women to take a quiz to determine whether they were daring enough for the shade, was one of the most successful cosmetic launches in American marketing history. The advertisement ran in Harper's Bazaar and women's magazines and proposed, with the general audacity of very good copywriting, that wearing a particular shade of red lipstick was a form of personality statement. You apply yours. You press a square of tissue between your lips to set it. You check your teeth for lipstick transfer, which is one of those small domestic rituals that belongs in the same category as checking the stove before you leave the house. Almost certainly unnecessary, but performed every single time anyway. The entire routine from foundation to setting powder to brows to mascara to lipstick takes approximately 15 minutes. You've been doing it for so many years that it has the quality of something practiced and automatic rather than something deliberate. The The hands know where to go. The mirror tells you if anything is wrong. Almost nothing is ever wrong. You step back from the mirror. You are ready. Ready not in the sense of having completed an optional enhancement, but ready in the sense that a professional is ready when they have put on their uniform. The makeup in the 1950s was not understood by the women who wore it as disguise or artifice in any negative sense. It was preparation. It was the exterior presentation of a person who had taken the day seriously enough to spend 15 minutes getting ready for it. Some historians have written about this dimension of 1950s beauty culture with a certain retrospective critique, noting the ways in which the expectation of daily full makeup represented an additional demand on women's time and energy that was not placed on men. This critique is accurate, but it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving on, because the women who maintained the standard, and most of them did maintain it, were not doing so with any sense of oppression. They were doing it because it was what you did, and because there was a genuine craft satisfaction in doing it well, and because the finished face in the mirror of a 1950s morning represented a kind of readiness that made sense within the structure of the day they were about to have. The floor is warmer now. The children are stirring down the hall. And your hair is done and your face is done, and it is now time to attend to the extraordinary labor of the rest of getting dressed. There are two drawers that matter in the order of getting dressed in a 1950s household, and you open them in a specific sequence. The first drawer contains stockings. Nylon stockings, folded carefully into small, neat packages with the precision of someone who understands that a mishandled nylon stocking runs at the first sign of disrespect. These are not cheap. They are not disposable. A snag that becomes a run means a stocking that must be retired. And retiring a stocking before it has delivered its reasonable expected service life is a form of waste that the 1950s housewife did not take lightly. You take out a pair and hold them up against the light from a bedroom window, turning them slowly, checking for any snags from the previous wearing. A small catch near the ankle that is not yet a run can sometimes be stopped in its tracks with a touch of clear nail polish applied immediately. This you know from experience. Several stockings have been saved this way. These ones are fine. You set them on the edge of the bed. The nylon stocking as a garment represented a post-war technological and cultural phenomenon that is easy to underestimate at this distance. Nylon itself had been introduced by DuPont in 1938 and was immediately recognized as a superior material for hosiery, stronger than silk, more durable, and significantly less expensive to produce. But wartime production had directed nylon almost entirely to military applications, including parachutes and other equipment. The rationing of silk and nylon stockings during the war years had been, according to contemporary accounts, genuinely distressing to American women in ways that the historical record preserves in considerable detail. When nylon stockings became available again after the war's end, the demand was immediate and intense. By the mid-1950s, nylon hosiery was a completely standard consumer product, available in every drugstore and department store in the country. The post-war prosperity meant that most women who wanted stockings could afford them, and most women wanted them. Bare legs, except in strictly limited contexts, were understood as informal to the point of being socially inappropriate for anything beyond casual summer activities. You wore stockings. The seam was a challenge. The seam at the back of a nylon stocking was not decorative. It was the point at which the knit fabric had been joined, and it ran from the heel of the foot up the back of the leg to the top of the stocking. It was the most visible feature of the stocking once it was on, and it had to be straight. This was not negotiable in any informal sense. A crooked seam was legible to other women the way a misfiled sentence is legible to a proofreader. Your eye finds it immediately, even if you weren't looking for it. And once you've seen it, it is difficult to see anything else. The checking of the seams was therefore a daily task. You put the stockings on, standing in your bare feet on the bedroom floor, and then you turn to look over your shoulder at the back of your legs in the mirror. If they were straight, you moved on. If they were not, you removed the stocking and started again, adjusting the position on the foot and smoothing it up the leg before checking again. This process rarely took more than 2 or 3 attempts, because you were practiced, but it occurred every morning nonetheless. The garter belt went on before the stockings, which was the order the logic of the thing required, but which also meant you had to remember to put on before the stockings and not after, because the reverse order once you had thought of the stockings and put them on first, resulted in a situation that was technically solvable but constituted an entirely unnecessary inconvenience to start the morning with. The garter belt was a band of fabric that sat at the waist or the upper hip, from which 4 hanging straps descended, each ending in a small clasp mechanism of metal and rubber designed to grip the welt at the top of the stocking. Each clasp had a small button that pressed down and released a retaining wire, and you manipulated this mechanism 4 times per morning, once per stocking clip, twice per leg, with the automatic efficiency of someone who had performed this operation approximately 2,000 times and no longer required conscious attention to accomplish it. The stockings attached. The seams were checked. Everything was in order. And now, the girdle. The post-war American girdle deserves its own unhurried moment of attention, because it was a far more significant piece of daily material culture than most historical accounts of the period have given it credit for being. It was not a garment worn occasionally, for special occasions, or only by women who felt some particular need to minimize their figures. It was worn by most American women who were old enough to be considered adults, on most days, as a standard and expected element of dress. The cultural historian Vicky Howard and others who have studied post-war American consumer culture have documented the extent to which foundation garments were considered baseline, not luxury, for mid-century American women. The girdle of the 1950s ranged considerably in construction. At the lighter end of the spectrum were open bottom styles made primarily of elastic fabric. The Playtex Living Girdle, for instance, was marketed as being so comfortable that you could wear it all day without discomfort, a marketing claim that told you something about what the alternatives were like. These lighter garments offered shaping and compression in the hip and abdominal area, without dramatic structural intervention. At the heavier end were the closed-bottom corselet styles, which combined girdle and bra in a single heavy-duty undergarment constructed of firm elastic, boning, and various reinforcing panels, and which took significant effort to get into and considerable adjustment to get comfortable, and which were understood to be necessary for dresses with a very specific silhouette. The silhouette of the 1950s required this infrastructure. The full skirt of the new look, introduced by Christian Dior in 1947, and diffused through every level of American women's clothing by the early 50s, sat over a nip waist. The pencil skirt, equally fashionable in different contexts, required a smooth hip line that most human bodies do not provide without assistance. The garments themselves were cut to assume the foundation undergarment was present. A full-skirted shirtwaist dress fitted for a woman wearing a girdle and a specific style of bra sat differently on that same woman without them, not better, not worse in any absolute sense, but differently, and the difference was the difference between the intended garment and a garment that was not quite working. You step into yours. The girdle goes on the way tight elastic always goes on, which is to say with intention, with a certain amount of working up from the ankle level, and then adjusting and smoothing once it's in position. The redistribution involved is real, but not dramatic. Once the girdle is on and settled and adjusted, you stop thinking about it. It becomes part of the background architecture of the body's day, present but not intrusive. The way a firm chair eventually becomes just a chair you're sitting in. Now the bra. The undergarment of the 1950s were engineering projects in the most literal sense, designed by people who understood that clothing behaved as a system, that the layers underneath created the shape that the layers outside expressed. The bra of the era is so distinct in its silhouette, that pointed, structured profile that appears in every period illustration, and which looks slightly startling to modern eyes, that it has become almost a shorthand for the decade's aesthetic. It was constructed of stiff fabric with substantial stitching and wiring that was not subtle and was not trying to be. Maidenform ran an extraordinarily successful advertising campaign throughout this period featuring the tagline, "I dreamed I," in my Maidenform bra, inserting the brand into various fantasy scenarios with the confidence of a company that understood it had a captive audience. The dress, or the house dress, the distinction between these two garments, and which one was appropriate for which occasion, was a distinction the 1950s woman maintained with some care. The house dress was a practical garment, typically cotton, with a simple cut, sometimes with zip front or button front for ease of putting on, in a print or solid color that was cheerful but not formal. It was the uniform of the domestic morning. It was what you wore to clean the house and make breakfast and manage the first hours of the day when you were not going anywhere, and not expecting anyone, and not presenting yourself to any social situation beyond immediate family. It was respectable but not dressy, and the distinction mattered. For anything beyond the house, the grocery store, the school, the church, any social engagement, you wore something better, a blouse and skirt, or a day dress, or a casual suit if the occasion warranted it. These garments were ironed, because ironing was a state in which fabric became acceptable rather than merely worn. The ironing happened on Tuesdays, typically, or sometimes Wednesdays. The specific day varied by household and by the week's other demands, but the underlying principle did not vary. Garments were ironed on a schedule, on an ironing board set up in the kitchen or the laundry room, or wherever the household had established as the ironing location, with an iron that was heated on the stove in older households or plugged into the wall in households with an electric iron. The steam iron, which became widely available in the 1950s and dramatically improved the ease of ironing cotton and linen, was a genuine revelation for women who maintained these standards. The dress you are putting on today has been ironed. It hangs in the closet with a faint residual smell of the warm iron-on cotton, which is one of those smells that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not encountered it, but which is immediately recognizable to anyone who has. Clean, dry, slightly starchy, the smell of fabric that has been organized. A well-ironed cotton house dress has a quality of presentedness that its Uniron counterpart lacks entirely, and part of the daily pleasure of getting dressed, for women who kept these standards, was the physical confirmation of that quality as the garment went on. You straighten your collar. You smooth your skirt over the girdle. You check the mirror on the back of the closet door. You have been awake for approximately 50 minutes. The hair is done. The face is done. The clothing is correct. The stockings are straight. You are ready for the rest of the family to be awake, which they are. The sound of small feet in the hallway above the kitchen is a particular sound of a house transitioning from your time to everyone's time, and you accept the transition without complaint because complaint would be absurd. This is the household. The household is what you manage. You manage it. The percolator is still warm. You pour yourself a second cup, and you begin the breakfast. Breakfast in a 1950s American household was, in its fullest expression, a significantly more elaborate meal than what most modern households produce on a regular school morning. The cultural expectation of the period, supported by nutritional advice of the era, domestic ideology as expressed through women's magazines, and the genuine caloric requirement of children and working adults, was that breakfast was a hot meal, a cooked meal, not a bowl of something cold with milk poured over it, though that happened, but a meal involving heat and the application of some skill and the use of the stovetop. Eggs were essential. The egg in 1950s American domestic life held a position that it has since somewhat ceded to other breakfast possibilities. But in this era, it was simply what morning protein looked like. You could prepare them fried, scrambled, poached, or boiled, depending on the family's preferences and your mood, and the preparation of each method was a skill you had developed over years to the point where you could produce a correctly runny-yolked fried egg without thinking about the process at all. You lay strips of bacon in the skillet first because the bacon takes longer and because the fat it renders in the pan is what the eggs will cook in, which is a sequence that is both practical and produces a flavor in the eggs that no amount of modern healthy cooking substitution has ever quite replicated, which is why the memory of those eggs remains so powerful for people who grew up with them. The bacon goes in cold because you start in a cold pan to render the fat gradually rather than searing it immediately, which you know from experience produces more even cooking and prevents the edges from curling up into little cylinders of charred protein. The sound and smell of bacon beginning to cook fills the kitchen within about 90 seconds of the pan going on the burner. It is a sound and a smell that carries a kind of biological authority, announcing itself to every sleeping person in the house with the efficiency of the world's most effective alarm clock. The children who were still upstairs at the onset of the bacon are generally not still upstairs by the time it is ready. You put the bread in the toaster. The toaster in a 1950s kitchen was either a gleaming chrome pop-up model. The pop-up mechanism had been the dominant toaster design since the 1930s, or, in older households, the swing door type that required you to flip the bread halfway through. The chrome pop-up toaster was a functional item that was also in the bright morning light of a 1950s kitchen. Something of an aesthetic object. Chrome was everywhere in 1950s kitchen design. Appliances fixtures, cabinet hardware. It reflected the light and suggested a kind of modernity, a relationship with the future that the post-war American kitchen was very enthusiastic about communicating. The bread was almost certainly white, commercially sliced, soft, uniform. Wonder Bread had been introducing itself to American families since 1921 with the claim that it builds strong bodies, later famously quantifying this as building strong bodies in 8 ways, and then 12 ways as the vitamin enrichment program expanded. By the mid-1950s, the soft, pillow-like texture of commercially sliced white bread was so deeply embedded in what children expected bread to taste and feel like that homemade bread, which was denser and crustier and required effort that the commercial product did not, was experienced by some children of the era as substantially less satisfying than the packaged alternative. This is perhaps the most complete victory in the history of food marketing. Orange juice appeared on the table, either from a glass pitcher in the refrigerator, the frozen concentrate reconstituted with water the previous evening, or, in more particular households, squeezed fresh that morning. Frozen orange juice concentrate had been developed as a byproduct of wartime food technology, specifically the work done by the Florida Citrus Commission and the United States Department of Agriculture in the 1940s to find ways of shipping citrus products without the weight and fragility of fresh juice. The resulting product, which you diluted with water in a 3-to-1 ratio, tasted different from fresh juice in a way that was immediately apparent to anyone with a functioning palate, but which had been so thoroughly normalized by marketing and habit that most children of the 1950s experienced frozen concentrate reconstituted juice as simply what orange juice was. The children arrive at the table in various states of readiness. One of them is fully dressed. One of them has lost a shoe. One of them has brought something to the table that does not belong at the table, which you quietly remove while pouring the juice without making it into a confrontation, because making it into a confrontation at 7 in the morning is an expenditure of everyone's energy that the day cannot sustain. You dish up the eggs. You put the bacon on the table in the pan lid, because you have already used 1 serving dish this morning, and the breakfast dishes are accumulating at a normal rate, which is the rate of a household with children in it. You butter the toast immediately as it comes out of the toaster, because toast buttered cold is a moral failure, and you have standards. The butter in the early 1950s was, in most households, actual butter, because while margarine was available and cheaper, the flavor argument for butter at the breakfast table was one that the American dairy industry had not yet lost in the domestic kitchen, and many housewives of this era simply preferred the real thing for everything that was eaten at the table. Your husband comes in. He is dressed. He has his briefcase or his work bag. He pours himself coffee, which is the one kitchen task that most husbands in the 1950s performed in the morning, and he sits at the table. The family breakfast in 1950s America was a sociological event as well as a nutritional one. The sociologist Mira Komarovsky, in her 1953 study Women in the Modern World, noted that the shared family meal was one of the primary sites of family cohesion as understood by the domestic ideology of the era, and the breakfast specifically represented the point at which the family's day was launched together. This significance was reinforced by everything from women's magazine features to nutrition research to school health education, all of which agreed, with a slightly breathless unanimity of people who have decided something is important, that the family breakfast was important. In practice, the family breakfast of the 1950s was often eaten quickly, with a specific backdrop of people who need to be somewhere in approximately 20 minutes and are working out the logistics of getting there. Your husband needs to leave by 7:40. The school bus comes at 8:10. These timelines organize a meal more than any sentimental notion of shared family time, but the fact that the meal happens at all, at the same table at the same time, with a hot-cooked breakfast rather than individual people foraging independently from the refrigerator, is genuinely different from the breakfast habits of many contemporary households and represents a specific form of domestic organization. You get up twice during the meal, once for the salt that someone needed and could not reach, once for a second piece of toast that was requested after the initial serving. You sit back down each time and resume your own breakfast, which has been going through cycles of partial warmth as the interruptions have spaced themselves across its duration, which is fine. This is the meal. Breakfast is finished in about 20 minutes. Your husband leaves with his briefcase and a kiss that catches you somewhere in the general vicinity of the left ear, which is the accurate trajectory of a man who is slightly late and moving at speed. The door closes. You stand at the kitchen window for a moment, watching the car back out of the driveway, and then you turn around and face the kitchen. The dishes are immediate. The children need to be checked and dispatched to school or otherwise managed, which is its own brief project. The table needs clearing. The skillet needs washing. The toaster needs the crumb tray emptied. The morning is underway. By 9 o'clock, the house is quiet again. The children are gone, and you stand in the kitchen with a third cup of coffee that you made yourself more or less as a reward for successfully executing the breakfast reduction, and you consider the day. There is a specific plan. The plan is not improvised. It follows a structure that most women of the 1950s absorbed culturally over years of observing their own mothers, reading women's magazines, and developing to their own experience the particular domestic management system that worked best for them. The system was expressed in most households as a weekly schedule in which specific heavy cleaning tasks were assigned to specific days, and those days were honored with the consistency of a professional obligation. Monday was laundry. This was perhaps the most inviolable fixture of the housewife's weekly schedule, the task around which other things were arranged rather than the task that accommodated other things. Laundry in the 1950s was not a 45-minute process of putting clothes in a machine and coming back later. Or rather, it was that in the sense that the washing machine did most of the mechanical work, but the surrounding labor, sorting, treating stains, loading and unloading and hanging and managing the sequence across multiple loads, made laundry day a genuine full-morning endeavor. The wringer washing machine, which required you to manually feed wet clothes through 2 rollers that pressed out the water before the clothes went to the rinse tub and then to the wringer again, was still common in the early years of the decade in many households. The automatic top loader was increasingly available and widely desired, but the transition was not complete. Tuesday was ironing, following Monday's wash. Wednesday was floors, which is today. You pull the vacuum cleaner out of the hall closet. The vacuum cleaner of the mid-1950s was a substantial domestic implement, not enormous, but solid, made of metal and rubber, with a motor that ran at a sound level that made conversation across a room essentially impossible, and which could be heard to the walls of most residential construction well enough that a neighbor could tell, simply by the sound, that you were vacuuming. This was considered acceptable evidence of household activity, rather than a noise nuisance, because household activity was understood as an ongoing and legitimate feature of the neighborhood soundscape. The Hoover Company had been the dominant vacuum cleaner brand in American homes since the 1920s, and by the 1950s the word Hoover was used by many people as a generic term for the appliance in the same way that certain other brand names have become a generic descriptor for their product category. Hoover introduced the Constellation in 1954, a canister-style vacuum that rested on a ball-shaped base and was designed to glide across the floor on its own exhaust, which it did, with a tendency to drift slightly to the left and occasionally to collide gently with the doorframe in a way that was charming rather than inconvenient. The Electrolux was another popular model, a low-slung metal canister on runners that you pull behind you across the floor like a very obedient metallic pet. You start in the living room. The rug, which in a 1950s middle-class home might be a room-size wool rug in a geometric or floral pattern, or wall-to-wall carpeting in the more modern homes built at the decade's end, receives the first attention of the machine. You push the upright back and forth in overlapping rows, and the machine does what it does, pulling the surface-level dust and debris and the hair and the crumbs that the eye did not catch and the small solids that children deposit in carpeting as a kind of continuous offering to the household. The hot dust smell rises immediately. It is the smell of the interior of every vacuum cleaner that has ever run on every rug in America, a smell of warm metal and processed household detritus. That is, when you have grown up with it, not unpleasant exactly, but simply the smell that vacuuming makes. The hallway takes about 4 minutes. The bedrooms take longer because each bed has to be moved slightly, or you have to work the crevice attachment along the baseboard and under frame, and the closet threshold needs attention. And the children's room has a particular relationship with mess that requires additional passes in the corners where things collect. The stairs are last. Vacuuming the stairs requires a different approach from vacuuming a flat surface. You kneel on the upper stairs and work down, doing each tread and riser individually with the machine held at an awkward angle or, in some households, with a smaller brush attachment that gets into the edges. It is the kind of work that is completely effective and entirely unglamorous and takes about 15 minutes and results in a staircase that looks unchanged to anyone who hasn't done it. Because clean stairs look exactly like stairs. But the dust is gone. This is what matters. The significance of the dust issue in 1950s homes is worth pausing on because it was a materially different situation from most modern residential environments. A significant percentage of American homes in the early 1950s were still heated by coal or oil furnaces that burned in the basement and distributed heat through a forced air or gravity system. Coal combustion produces a fine particulate that settles on surfaces throughout the house, a thin dark film that accumulates on windowsills and horizontal surfaces, and in carpet fibers with quiet persistence. Even in areas without coal heat, the industrial and automotive pollution in mid-century American air was substantially greater than in the post-environmental regulation era. American cities in the 1950s frequently had visible smog. The air that came through an open window carried a heavier load of particulates than most people today would recognize. The vacuum cleaner was not a luxury or convenience in this context. It was the only viable mechanism for managing a real and ongoing problem. After the vacuuming, the mop. The kitchen and bathroom floors in most 1950s middle-class homes were linoleum, a product that had been used in American residential construction since the late 19th century, and which by the post-war era was available in a range of patterns and colors that serve as a reliable record of the decade's aesthetic preferences. You could have your kitchen floor in black and white checkerboard, or in a geometric design in 2 shades of green, or in an abstract pattern that suggested someone had experimented enthusiastically with the design possibilities before the pattern went into production. Linoleum was practical. It was easy to install. It was reasonably easy to clean. It also showed every footprint, every scuff mark, every place where someone had dragged a chair across it without lifting, and it required mopping on a schedule that reflected this. The bucket came from under the sink. The wringer mop, the kind with a squeeze mechanism built into bucket, rather than a separate wringer, was pulled from the closet. You filled the bucket with warm water and a measured amount of cleaning solution, which in the 1950s might be Pine Sol or Lust Oil, or any of several competing products that cleaned and disinfected, and left behind a scent designed to communicate cleanliness to anyone who entered the kitchen in the following hour. The mopping was systematic. You started at the far end of the kitchen from the door, working your way toward it, which was how you avoided mopping yourself into a corner and then either walking on a wet floor or standing in it for an extended period while it dried. This was not something that was taught to you. It was something you figured out the first time you mopped yourself into a corner, stood in for 10 minutes, and decided not to do that again. The floor dried while you moved to the bathroom. Same bucket, fresh water. The bathroom linoleum in most 1950s homes was either a continuation of the kitchen linoleum or contrasting design, and it required the same systematic attention. The bathroom floor collected hair and soap residue and the general evidence of multiple people using a small space, and mopping on a regular schedule was the only thing standing between the present state of the floor and a state that you did not want to think about. While the floors dried, you dusted. Dusting was its own undertaking, separate from the vacuuming and separate from the mopping, addressing the flat horizontal surfaces that neither of those processes reached. The top of the refrigerator, the window ledges, the tops of the kitchen cabinets, which collected dust of distinctly kitchen character, dusty, slightly greasy, the result of cooking vapors that rise and cool and deposit their content on whatever flat surfaces above them. The surfaces in the living room, the side tables, the mantelpiece if there was one, furniture polish on the wood surfaces. The aerosol furniture polish, which Pledge would introduce in 1958, was a transformation of this particular task. Before it, you used paste wax or liquid wax applied with cloth and buffed by hand, which produced a superior shine in the opinion of many experienced housekeepers, and a completely unnecessary expenditure of elbow grease in the opinion of most other people. The aerosol version was fast and effective and smelled of synthetic lemon, and left a shine that photographed beautifully and attracted fingerprints with the enthusiasm of a surface that has developed strong opinions about participation. You finished the dusting. You check the clock. It is 10:30. You have been awake for 5.5 hours. You have done your hair, your face, gotten dressed, Maid and serve and clean up breakfast, manage the dispatch of the family to school and work, vacuum the entire house, including the stairs, mop 2 rooms, and dusted all the flat surfaces. The house looks the same as it did when you woke up. Not better, not cleaner in any visibly dramatic way. It looks like a maintained house. A house that someone is keeping at a particular standard rather than letting drift downward under the pressure of daily use. The cleaning is not about transformation. It is about prevention. Preventing the entropy that is a natural condition of any space where people live from gaining ground. It will be more work to recover than to prevent. You are not cleaning today. You are maintaining the gains from yesterday's cleaning. This is the actual work of the house, and it has no finish line except the end of the day. You allow yourself to sit down. The coffee is cold, but you drink it anyway. The chair faces a window and the backyard is there. The clothesline, the small patch of grass your husband mowed last Saturday, the fence along the back where the neighbor's rose bush has grown over in summer and drops petals onto your side in June. It is October now and the rose bush is dormant sticks, and the clothesline is empty because Monday's wash is done and put away. In about 15 minutes, you need to put on your coat and go to the market. But the chair is comfortable and the coffee, even cold, still tastes like the morning, and there's no particular requirement that you leap up immediately. 15 minutes. You put on your coat and your good shoes and you take your shopping bag and your purse and you go to the grocery store. This sounds like a straightforward errand. It is not a straightforward errand. Going to the grocery store in 1953 required a set of preparations and a level of personal presentation that would strike most modern grocery shoppers as excessive, which tells you something about how much has changed in the social expectations attached to everyday activities. The coat went on because you were going out. Going out, in the social understanding of the 1950s woman, required appropriate dress in a way that was distinct from the dress required for being at home. The house dress was for the house. Going to the market, going to the bank, go to school to drop something off. Going anywhere that placed you in view of people who were not your immediate family required something that communicated that you had taken the occasion seriously. For most women, this was not a particularly formal standard. A decent coat, perhaps gloves in cooler weather, appropriate shoes, but it was a standard, and departing from it significantly was an act of either carelessness or defiance, and you were doing neither today. The shopping bag was the practical element. Grocery bags of the 1950s came in paper from the store, and the paper bags of this era were substantial and well constructed, able to carry a reasonable amount of weight without failing catastrophically, unlike certain subsequent evolutions in grocery bag design that appear to have been tested in controlled laboratory conditions that did not include a dozen canned goods and a raw chicken. But many women also brought their own bag or basket, particularly for shorter shopping trips, both for practicality and for the slightly environmental reasoning that predated the environmental movement by some decades. Bags cost money, and using your own was thrifty. The grocery landscape of the early to mid-1950s was in the middle of a significant and interesting transition. The supermarket as a concept had existed since the late 1930s. The first true self-service supermarkets had appeared in California and the New York area in that era, but the full flowering of the large, high-volume, full-service supermarket was a post-war phenomenon enabled by the combination of post-war prosperity, suburban growth, the increasing prevalence of automobiles that could transport larger quantities of groceries, and a food processing and packaging industry that was producing an ever-expanding variety of products for which the supermarket was the ideal retail environment. By the mid-1950s, there were approximately 20,000 supermarkets operating in the United States, a number that had grown from just a few thousand before the war, and that would continue growing for another decade. These were large, brightly lit stores with wide aisles and music piped in through ceiling speakers, and the frozen food section expanded to include things that would not have been imaginable in a grocery store a decade earlier. The frozen food section deserves its own moment of attention, because in the 1950s, it was still something of a novelty and a marvel. Deep freezer technology for home use and commercial cold chain logistics for distribution had improved enough by the late 1940s that a genuine frozen food industry was possible, and the products filling the frozen cases by 1953 included frozen vegetables, peas, corn, green beans, frozen fruit, frozen fish, and the Swanson TV dinner, which had arrived in 1953 and which represented something genuinely new in American food culture. The TV dinner, an aluminum tray with compartments for turkey or chicken, a starchy side of vegetable, and sometimes a dessert, designed to be heated in the oven for 25 minutes and eaten while watching television, was marketed as a convenience product for specific occasions rather than as a regular meal solution. Its existence was understood by most housewives not as a replacement for cooking, but as a backup for emergencies, a legitimate option for nights when the normal meal couldn't happen, an indulgence for children being supervised by a sitter. The woman who served TV dinners regularly without a specific excuse was widely understood, in the social grammar of the mid-century kitchen, to be deficient in the domestic arts, a judgment that the advertising of the era both reflected and reinforced with cheerful consistency. You walk to the frozen section, but today you are not buying frozen dinners. Today you are buying pot roast ingredients and vegetables and whatever else is on the list, which you have developed over the past 2 days in your head. A running mental inventory of the pantry, in the refrigerator, and the bread box that is now ready to be addressed. The list in a 1950s household was not improvised. It was a result of a continuous mental accounting that the housewife maintained as part of the background operation of her day, the way a restaurateur keeps track of what's in the walk-in cooler. You knew, at most points during the week, approximately what was in the pantry, what was running low, what was gone, and what needed to be replenished before which day based on the plan menus. The grocery list was this information converted into the currency of the shopping trip. Grocery budgeting was an equally serious discipline. The household money in most 1950s families operated on a specific and understood allocation. The husband earned the income. A portion of it was designated as the household budget, which covered groceries, household supplies, children's expenses, and the various smaller costs of maintaining the domestic operation. The housewife managed this allocation with the skill the situation demanded, which was considerable skill. Overspending the grocery budget in a household with a tight margin was a real problem with real consequences, not an abstract concern. This meant that the trip through the grocery store involved continuous calculation. You compared prices between brands. You made decisions about whether the slight price premium for the name brand product was worth it for this particular item. You noticed whether something you normally bought was on sale and adjusted your plan accordingly. You held the running total in your head because the cash register at checkout was not a place for surprises. At the butcher counter, you spoke with the butcher about the chuck roast. This kind of specific conversation was still a feature of grocery shopping in the 1950s, particularly at the meat counter, because a knowledgeable butcher could tell you which cut had arrived freshest that week, could recommend the appropriate size for the number of people you were feeding, could address the specific cooking method you were planning. The relationship between a regular customer and a butcher who knew her preferences was one of the functional social relationships of the domestic world. Quiet and transactional in manner, but genuinely useful in content. You selected the roast he recommended. You added it to the basket. The checkout line at the grocery store in the 1950s was frequently a brief social event. You recognized the woman ahead of you in line as someone from the church committee. You exchanged a few sentences about the committee meeting on Thursday. The cashier, who knew your family's buying patterns from long acquaintance, may have commented on the size of the chuck roast. These micro-interactions, brief and functionally embedded in an errand, constituted one of the primary forms of social contact available during the working day for women whose domestic role kept them largely within a defined geographic radius. You paid. You thanked the cashier. You carried the bags to the door. The walk home with a heavy bag of groceries is not a dramatic event, but it is worth noting physically. The bags pulled at your arms and the canvas handles cut into the skin of your palms in a specific way that was so familiar by this point in your life that you barely registered it. You shifted the weight from one arm to the other without thinking. Your good shoes were not designed for walking distances with heavy loads, but they were what you had on because these were your shoes for being out, and you were out. You arrived home. You unpacked the bag systematically. Cold things into the refrigerator first. The chuck rose immediately because it was substantial and needed to stay cold until you were ready to use it. Canned goods to the pantry, arranged on the shelf in the order of use. Oldest items at the front. Bread to the bread box. Produced to the refrigerator crisper. Everything in its place. The pantry was restocked. The kitchen was ready. Now there was the small matter of dinner. It is 1:30 in the afternoon. The light through the kitchen window is the soft golden quality of autumn afternoon light. The kind that arrives at an angle and illuminates the dust you didn't get in the corners, and makes the kitchen look both beautiful and judgmental simultaneously. The pot roast needs to go in by 2 o'clock at the latest if it is going to be ready by 5:30, which is when it needs to be ready, which means you have about 30 minutes to begin the preparations. You take the chuck roast out of the refrigerator. Pot roast was a staple of mid-century American cooking for reasons that were partly cultural and partly practical. The chuck cut of beef was one of the more economical options available, derived from the shoulder of the animal, which is a heavily used muscle group that produces meat with a great deal of connective tissue and intramuscular fat. These features, which made the chuck unsuitable for quick, high-heat cooking methods, made it ideal for slow braising, a process in which long exposure to low heat and moist environment converted the connective tissue into gelatin, resulting in meat that was tender, falling apart, deeply flavored in ways that more expensive cuts cooked more quickly never achieved. The popularity of braised pot roast in the 1950s cookbook was not incidental. It was a reflection of the domestic cooking strategy of a generation of housewives who understood that inexpensive cuts could produce genuinely excellent meals if the investment was in time rather than in the cost of the ingredient. Betty Crocker's picture cookbook, published in 1950 and selling 2 million copies in its first year release, included multiple pot roast recipes and organized its meat cooking section around the principle that understanding the cut determined the method and the method determined the outcome. It was a kind of practical, non-condescending instruction that the best domestic writing of the era provided, treating the reader as an intelligent person who needed information, not inspiration. You season the roast. Salt and pepper press into the surface, which you've dried with a clean cloth, because moisture on the surface of the meat prevents the browning. That is the entire point of the next step. The Dutch oven goes on the burner with a small amount of fat, either the rendered lard that you keep in a can in the refrigerator or neutral oil, because this is the point at which the depth of the flavor you're building begins. The fat needs to be hot before the meat goes in. You know this. You wait. The roast is a hot fat, and the sound is immediate and theatrical, the loud, spitting sizzle of cold meat meeting something very hot. And the smell of the Maillard reaction rises into the kitchen with the authority of something that has been happening over human cooking fires since long before there were kitchens to smell it in. You do not turn the roast immediately. You let it sit, undisturbed, for 3 or 4 minutes, until the crust is formed and the meat releases naturally from the surface of pan. Then you turn it. You brown all sides. This takes about 15 minutes in total. It is not glamorous work, but it is important work, and you do it with attention, adjusting the heat when the pan gets too hot, because a pan that gets too hot and burns the fat creates a bitter quality in the braising liquid that the long cooking time will not fully dissipate. The vegetables. Carrots cut into 2-inch pieces, because smaller than that, and they'll dissolve before the roast is done, which is acceptable if you want a vegetable puree, but you don't. Potatoes halved or quartered depending on their size. An onion quartered. A stalk of celery, because celery in a braise provides background flavor even if no one ever eats the celery itself, which is a correct relationship to have with celery in a braise. These go into the pot around the browned roast, arranged not artistically but practically, tucked in around the sides where they'll be in contact with the liquid. The liquid, you add beef broth or water with a spoonful of canned consommé dissolved in it until it comes about a third of the way up the side of the roast. A splash of Worcestershire sauce for depth. A bay leaf. Thyme if you have it. The herbs in the 1950s kitchen were primarily the dried ones arranged in small tins on a wire spice rack mounted to the wall near the stove. Because fresh herbs in the mid-century American kitchen were not yet the readily available commodity, they would become later. Dried thyme smells different from fresh, more concentrated and slightly dusty, and it needs to cook for a longer time to release its character into a dish, which is why it is well suited to a 3-hour braise where it will have ample opportunity. The lid goes on. The Dutch oven goes into the oven, which you have preheated to 325 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a temperature at which the cooking happens slowly and patiently rather than quickly and aggressively, maintaining a gentle simmer inside the covered pot rather than a boil. A boil would make the meat tough. Patience is the technique. Now, there are approximately 2.5 hours. These hours were a structural feature of the long cooking dinner, rather than an accident of the recipe. The afternoon cooking period in the domestic schedule of the 1950s housewife was a time of what you might call supervised leisure. You were not free in the sense of having no obligations, because the roast required periodic checking, and dinner was coming, and there was always something. But the checking requirement was every 45 minutes at most, which meant that most of the interval could be used for other things. The ironing that didn't get done Tuesday, if the week had been full. The mending, which was a more consistent feature of 1950s domestic life than most modern households experienced, because clothing was both more expensive relative to income and significantly more reparable than the disposable fast fashion of later eras. A pair of trousers with a torn seam could be re-sewn in 10 minutes. A worn elbow on a sweater could be patched or darned. The zipper that had started behaving unreliably could be replaced. These repairs were performed as a matter of course rather than as an extraordinary effort, and the mending basket, a container of damaged and needy items sitting by the chair in the living room or the sewing table in the bedroom, was a constant presence in most households. The afternoon was also when the telephone was most active. The telephone of the 1950s was a fixed and finite object. It sat in a specific location in the house. The kitchen wall mount or the hallway table were the most common positions, attached by a cord that went into the wall on one end and into the phone's base on the other, and from a phone's base another cord connected to the handset, and that handset cord was the entire radius of movement available to you during a telephone conversation. This was approximately 3 feet in most configurations. The possibility of wandering around the kitchen while talking on the phone, or moving from room to room, or sitting on the stairs while you talked, was determined entirely by the mathematics of the cord length and the distance from the phone's fixed position. And yet conversations happened. Long ones. The afternoon telephone call, particularly the call between neighboring or related women who had been out of contact since the previous day, was one of the primary social rituals of the 1950s domestic afternoon. Research on telephone usage patterns from this era consistently shows a distinct peak in residential calling between roughly noon and 4 in the afternoon, which corresponds exactly to the period when the women who were home alone, and the activity level of the house had temporarily dropped below the breakfast and after-school peaks. You might call your mother, or your mother might call you. The relationship between mid-century housewives and their mothers was a subject that the women's magazines periodically addressed with the tact of people navigating something genuinely complex. The mother-in-law who offered too much advice about housekeeping, the own mother who missed you now that you live 15 miles away, the sister who had questions about the children. Telephone calls addressed all of this and preserved the connection in ways that the letter, which was still a regular part of mid-century communication, but was slower and more formal, could not. You might also, in the afternoon, have company. The coffee visit or the afternoon drop-in was a feature of the 1950s suburb that has been documented in the oral histories of women from the period with a consistency that suggests it was nearly universal. A neighbor coming over for a cup of coffee in the mid-morning or early afternoon was neither unusual nor unannounced nor particularly exceptional. It was simply what neighbors did. The social architecture of the close suburban street, where houses were near enough to see into each other's kitchens and the front yards were continuous and fenced only at the back, create a physical environment that made casual visiting easy and natural in a way that more dispersed or more private residential environments did not. The sociologist Herbert Gans, in his 1967 study of Levittown, New Jersey, one of the new planned suburban communities that came to symbolize the post-war residential landscape, documented the intensity of neighbor interaction in these environments in ways that struck some contemporary readers as overwhelming, and that residents themselves described, on the whole, as one of the things they genuinely liked about where they lived. You knew your neighbors. You were in and out of each other's kitchens. You watched each other's children for an hour when someone needed to run an errand. You mentioned casually what you'd seen at the grocery store that morning. These interactions were not trivial. For women whose daily lives were organized almost entirely within the domestic sphere, the neighbor kitchen visit was often the primary adult intellectual exchange of the day. It was where opinions formed and where information circulated, and where the experience of living this particular kind of life was given the company of recognition. The timer on the oven goes off. You check the roast. It needs another hour. The vegetables are beginning to soften. The liquid has reduced slightly and darkened, and smells of beef and herbs, and the slightly complex note of something that has been cooking slowly in a good pot for a while. You put the lid back on and return to the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, the quality of the light has shifted. It comes through the kitchen windows at a lower angle now, that late afternoon gold that is the most domestic of all lights, the light that makes everything look like it is slightly in the past already. The smell of the pot roast has saturated the entire house by now, moved through the hallway and up the stairs and into the bedrooms, which means that when the children get home in about 45 minutes, they will already be hungry before they reach the kitchen door. But before the children arrive and before the evening begins, there is a dimension of this day that has been running underneath all the other activity like a second current. Something that occupied real mental and emotional space in the 1950s woman's life, and that doesn't show up in the physical tasks, but was no less a part of the day, the life of the community, and the specific obligations and pleasures that came with being a woman embedded in it. The church was at the center of this. The statistics on religious attendance in post-war America are striking. Gallup polling from 1958 reported that 49% of Americans attended religious services on a typical weekend, the highest level recorded up to that point. Church construction was at historic highs. Denominational membership was growing. The post-war religious revival, sometimes described by historians as a reaction to the existential uncertainty of the atomic age or as an expression of the gratitude and aspirational security of a prosperous society, was real and measurable and visible in the landscape of every American suburb. For women specifically, the church community provided something that the domestic structure of the 1950s did not reliably provide elsewhere, a role outside the house that was publicly recognized and socially valued. The women who taught Sunday school and organized the church social calendar and ran the women's auxiliary and coordinated the charity drives were engaged in skilled organizational work that was visible, appreciated, and understood as a genuine contribution to a community institution that mattered. This was not entirely interchangeable with the invisible work of the house, which was also skilled and important, but which was, by its nature, not visible to anyone who benefited from it. The relationship between mid-century American women and their religious communities has been examined by historians, including Colleen McDaniel, whose work on the domestic religion of the post-war period traced the ways in which religious practice in the 1950s was organized significantly around women's contributions, while simultaneously occupying a discourse that centered male religious authority. Women ran the operations that made church communities function: the committees, the social events, the educational programs for children, the pastoral support networks, the fundraising. They did this work with genuine commitment and often genuine faith, and frequently with a particular pleasure that comes from organizational competence deployed in service of something you believe in. The Parent-Teacher Association was a secular parallel to this. Membership in the PTA in a 1950 suburban community was not optional in any meaningful social sense. You joined. You attended the monthly meetings at the school, held in the cafeteria with folding chairs set out in rows, and the school principal present, and a specific agenda that addressed specific school community concerns. You volunteered for the book fair. You helped with a fundraising carnival. You were present when the school needed parents to be present, because being present was part of the shared work of maintaining the educational environment that your children were in. The women's club was another layer. Garden clubs, bridge clubs, book clubs, sewing circles, civic improvement associations, hospital volunteer auxiliaries. The number of organized associations that an American woman of the 1950s might maintain membership in would strike most contemporary people as extraordinary. William H. White, writing in The Organization Man in 1956 about the organizational life of the post-war suburb, documented the density of association membership in these communities with a slightly bewildered admiration of someone who had not previously understood how much social engineering was required to make a neighborhood actually function. These clubs and organizations were not simply social pleasure, though they were often that too. They were the infrastructure through which communities maintained themselves. The Christmas food drive was organized through the Church Women's Guild. The welcome wagon that visited new neighbors was organized through a neighborhood association. The school library's new books were funded through the PTA book fair that the mothers planned and ran. The hospital gift shop that provided small comforts to patients was staffed by volunteers from the women's auxiliary. The work was real. The time was real. And all was layered on top of the domestic work that was already real. that was already full. That was already the primary structure of the day. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The organizational life that 1950s women maintained was not instead of the housework and the cooking and the childcare. It was an addition to it. The community work happened in the afternoons when the house was quiet and the dinner was in the oven. In the evenings when the children were asleep and the dishes were done. On the Saturday mornings when the husband was home and could mind the children. The total weekly hours spent on domestic labor plus community obligations would, if accounted for in a way that paid work is accounted for, add up to numbers that most people today would find genuinely alarming. This fact was not discussed in the 1950s. In those terms, the framing that was available was a framing of the women's magazine and the domestic ideology. The well-organized housewife managed her time efficiently and had plenty of it for the things that mattered. The implication was that if you were overwhelmed, the problem was with your time management rather than with the volume of the expectation. This framing was not entirely accurate, and the generation of women who lived within it would spend much of the following decade working out a more accurate one. But in the afternoon of this particular day, you are not thinking about any of this in these terms. You are thinking about whether the gravy needs to be thicker and what you have for dessert, and whether there's enough bread for after dinner if the children eat it all at dinner. The timer goes off. The roast is done. The door opens at 5:04 and the sound of children entering the house is the specific sound of gravity increasing. Shoes dropped in the hallway. Bags dropped in the hallway. Something dropped in the hallway that lands with a sound that you will investigate in a moment. The specific verbal content of the immediate post-arrival communication from children who have been at school for 7 hours and are now extremely hungry is, in most households, essentially the same, a declaration of the extreme degree of the hunger, delivered at a volume calibrated to communicate urgency. You are already in the kitchen. The pot roast is resting on the counter. You are making the gravy. Gravy from a braise is not complicated, but it is a process. You ladle the braising liquid from the Dutch oven into a saucepan on the burner, leaving the meat and vegetables in the warm pot. You taste it. It is quite good. You skim the fat from the surface, which rises and can be removed with a spoon if you're patient. Then you make a slurry of flour and cold water, whisking them together until smooth, and you add it to the liquid in the saucepan gradually, whisking constantly, and you turn the heat up and watch it thicken. Too thick. You add a bit of the remaining braising liquid. Too thin. You let it cook a bit longer. You season it again. You taste it again. Gravy, when it works, has a depth and complexity that comes entirely from using the cooking liquid of a well-seasoned braise as its base. It tastes of everything the pot roast was cooked with, concentrated and slightly enriched by the flour, and it transforms the rest of the plate's components in ways that most sauces do not. This is not complicated cooking. This is cooking that works by patience and by using the right material. You mash the potatoes separately in the pot you boiled them in. The process involves draining the water, adding butter and warm milk in specific amounts that you have calibrated over years of doing this particular task, and working the potato with a masher, a simple hand tool with a perforated or wavy face, until the texture is what you want. Perfectly smooth mashed potatoes require effort, because a hand masher produces a slightly textured result, and getting to smooth requires either more work or a ricer. Most 1950s home cooks accepted a slight texture, which was also good and was what their families had grown up with, and therefore what their families considered correct. The table is set. The children have been separated from whatever argument they were developing in the hallway. The bread is sliced. Your husband arrives at 5:45, slightly later than expected, and dinner is on the table by 6, which is within the acceptable window rather than the ideal window, and he doesn't mention it and you don't mention it. The pot roast is served on a platter. The vegetables are arranged around it. The gravy is in the gravy boat, which is a small ceramic vessel with a handle and a pouring spout that is part of the everyday china, and which serves no purpose other than this particular purpose, but which represents, in the 1950s household, a specific form of domestic attention. The detail of not simply serving gravy in a bowl, but in the correct vessel for gravy. Dinner takes about 25 minutes. The conversation, what there is of it, moves across the topics of the day's events, none of which is particularly significant, but all of which constitute the social texture of a family dinner table. The television is not on during dinner in most households in the mid-1950s. The set is in the living room, and dinner is at the dining table, and the convention, which the women's magazines actively promoted and which many families followed, was that the dinner table was for the family and not for television. The meal is cleared, and now comes the second major kitchen cleanup of the day. Washing dishes by hand in a household of 5. The dinner plates, the serving platter, the gravy boat, the potato pot, the roasting pan, the glassware, the cutlery takes between 25 and 35 minutes. You follow the order. Glassware first, because the water is clean and hot and glasses need to be clear and spotless. Then plates and bowls. Then cutlery. Then serving pieces. Then pots and pans, which go last because they're the greasiest and would contaminate the water for everything else if you did them first. The dish soap of the 1950s was Ivory Liquid, Orville, or Joy. Introduced in 1950 and marketed as the first liquid dish soap that could cut grease without harming the hands. The condition of the hands was not a trivial concern for women who washed dishes by hand twice a day in hot water. Dishpan hands was a real phenomenon and an extensively addressed problem in the advertising of the era, because the advertising of the era had correctly identified that the hands of the woman who washed dishes were a problem that companies selling hand cream and rubber gloves and gentle dish soaps could address, and it set about addressing it with considerable enthusiasm. You wash. You place the clean items in the drying rack. You rinse. Your hands are in water that starts hot and cools gradually over the half hour. By the end, your hands are slightly red and slightly wrinkled in the specific way that water produces on skin over time, and you dry them carefully on the dish towel, and then perhaps apply a little hand cream from the bottle on the windowsill above the sink. The kitchen is clean again, the third time today, or the fourth if you count the after-lunch cleanup separately, which you might. The children need to be settled. It is 7 o'clock in the evening. In the living room, the television is on, and your husband is in his chair. The program is something Milton Berle or Jack Benny or Arthur Godfrey, or one of the dramatic programs that were beginning to assert themselves as the decade progressed and the media matured. The sound of the television from the living room reaches the kitchen as a companionable murmur, the sound of a household at rest after its working hours. The children's homework is at the kitchen table, with one child still working on arithmetic. You sit across from him and do not do the arithmetic for him, but indicate when an answer is wrong and require him to think again rather than simply correcting it, because this is the method that produces learning rather than simply correct homework. He arrives at the right answer eventually and looks up at you with the specific expression of someone who has accomplished something and knows it. Homework is done by 7:30. Baths happen on bath nights, which are Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday in most households. Wednesday is not a bath night, so the children's bedtime preparation this evening is abbreviated. Teeth brushing, which is overseen because unsupervised children brushing teeth in the 1950s produced results that could be charitably described as impressionistic, and the changing into pajamas and the settling into beds with a specific combination of urgency and delay that children deploy around bedtime with the practiced instinct of professionals. You read to the younger child if they are still young enough to require a story. The children's literature of the 1950s was in a period of considerable vitality. Goodnight Moon had been published in 1947 and was already on its way to becoming the bedtime book against which all other bedtime books are measured. Dr. Seuss was publishing regularly, with A Cat in the Hat arriving in 1957. Though you don't have that one yet, you read what you have, which is good enough, which is more than good enough, which is the voice you use at bedtime, slow and warm, and slightly flat in the way that voices naturally go when a child is lying still in a dark room, and the day is winding down. You check on the older child, who is in bed with a book and a flashlight, because older children always have flashlights, and you indicate with a kind of parental expression that requires no words that it's time for the lights to be genuinely off, and you close their door most of the way. The hallway is quiet. You go back downstairs. Your husband is still in his chair. The television is showing something else now. You sit in the other chair, which is yours in the sense that shared chairs in a domestic living room develop ownership through repetition rather than deed, and you either watch what's on or you do the mending or both simultaneously, which is how a great deal of the domestic mending in the 1950s got done, while something else was happening that didn't require full attention. The mending basket in the 1950s household was, as mentioned earlier, a continuous presence. Sewing skills were essentially universal among the women of this generation. Not the specialized skills of tailoring or dressmaking, though many women had those too, but the basic repertoire. The straight seam, the button replacement, the darn sock, the repaired hem. These were skills learned from mothers and in home economics classes in school, and they were applied regularly in households where the cost of clothing made repair a sensible economic choice. Home economics, as a discipline taught in American schools, was at its peak influence in the 1950s. The subject covered cooking, sewing, household management, child development, personal hygiene, and domestic budgeting. It was taught almost exclusively to girls, who took it while boys took shop class, which is an arrangement that describes a great deal about the underlying assumptions of the era, without requiring further elaboration. The skills imparted were genuine skills. The gender segregation of their transmission was a feature of the era that its inheritors would spend the following decades contesting. Your husband has gone to bed by 9, or by 9:30. He rises early too, and the evening has a natural gravity that pulls everyone towards sleep by 10 at the latest in a household of 5 or 5:30 morning. You stay up a bit longer, not because you have specific remaining tasks, though you might. The lunches for tomorrow could be prepared tonight, the coffee set up as you do every night, the list for the next day's grocery needs updated. But partly because this is the last quiet space of the day that belongs to no one's needs but yours. And even if you simply sit in the chair with the mending done and the television turned low, the sitting is itself a form of rest that the day has not offered until now. It is 9:45. You will be awake before the alarm. But before you go upstairs, there is one more set of habits to complete. One more sequence of daily practice that mirrors the mornings and that, in its own way, closes a loop on what the day has been. You go to the bathroom. You look in the mirror. The face in the mirror looks like someone who has been up since 5 in the morning and has done a full day's work. Not dramatically tired. Just present. Honest. The face with its end-of-day makeup. Slightly faded now. Slightly settled into the lines of the skin in the way that foundation does after 12 hours. Is a face that has been in use. The cold cream first. You open the jar of Pond's cold cream, which has been on the bathroom shelf for as long as the bathroom has had a shelf, or feels that way. The cold cream has a specific smell, mineral oil and rose water, and something faintly chemical that is not unpleasant, just distinctly itself. Distinctly cold cream and nothing else. You apply it to your face with your fingertips, working it into the skin in small circular motions, and you feel the texture of it, thick and smooth, settling over the day's foundation, and beginning its work of dissolution. Then you wipe it off. The cold cream method of removing makeup works by the principle that oil dissolves oil. The mineral oil in the cold cream loosens the foundation and lipstick and mascara from the skin surface, and you wipe them all off together on a cotton pad or a square of tissue, and what comes off is a complete record of the day's makeup in brownish beige and red and black, all of it deposited on the cotton in a single pass. The cotton goes in the wastebasket. The face is clean. Or closer to clean, because the cold cream also leaves a film of mineral oil on the skin that constitutes the next step, the night cream. Whether the night cream does anything meaningful for the skin's long-term condition is a question that the cosmetic science of the 1950s was not equipped to answer with rigor, and the cosmetic companies that sold the products were not especially motivated to commission the research. What the night cream did, as a material fact, was prevent the skin from drying out overnight in the low humidity environment of a heated bedroom. And this was genuine and useful. That it might additionally reverse the effect of aging was the advertising's more ambitious claim. You apply the night cream. You apply the eye cream, which smells of cucumber and cream, to the thin skin under and around the eyes. You apply a separate preparation to your neck, because the neck is important, and the night cream you are using is denser than what the neck requires. Then you sit at the dressing table. This is the part that takes 25 minutes. You take out the pin curl clips from the dish where you put them this morning. You take out the setting lotion from the shelf. You take a section of your styled hair, which is now a day old, and you dampen it slightly and begin the process of returning it to its nighttime configuration. Section by section, curl by curl, clip by clip, the reverse of this morning's comb out, performed in reverse sequence, returning the head to the state in which it will spend the night. The women who kept this practice, and most women of this era did keep it, developed a very specific set of manual skills in the management of their own hair that went unrecognized as skills because they were domestic rather than professional, because they were performed in private rather than in public, and because they had been so thoroughly normalized that they appeared simply as part of what women did rather than as what women had learned to do over years of practice. The ability to section hair accurately in the back of your own head without being able to see what you're doing, using feel and memory rather than vision, is a genuine physical skill. You had it. You don't think about it. The last curl is secured. The scarf is tied. You look at yourself in the mirror one more time. This version of yourself that exists only at the very end of the day. Face clean, hair done up, the scarf, the robe, the expression of someone who has accomplished everything that needed to be accomplished and is now, finally, permitted to stop. You get up from the dressing table. You turn off the bathroom light. You walk down the hallway. At the first bedroom door, you pause and look in. The older child is asleep. The book is on the floor next to the bed where it was put down when sleep arrived. You pick it up quietly and set it on the nightstand and close the door halfway. At the next door, the younger child is deeply asleep in the way that young children sleep, with an absolute commitment to unconsciousness that adults cannot quite replicate, arms flung wide, breath slow and even. You stand there for a moment longer than is necessary, because the moment does not require anything of you except to be in it. And so you are in it. You pull the door to. You go to your own room. The sheets are cool on your side, which is the best quality of sheets. And the weight of the blanket is the specific weight that your body has calibrated over years of sleeping under it as the correct weight. Your husband is already deeply asleep, breathing at a frequency that you have long since stopped hearing. The room is dark. The street outside is quiet, the late evening quiet of a neighborhood that has put its children to bed and is itself settling towards sleep. Your mind does one last inventory. The bread is sufficient for tomorrow. The dentist appointment. You need to call in the morning before 9 because that's when the office opens. The church committee meeting is Thursday evening, which means dinner needs to be organized around that. The washing machine made a sound this week that was different from the normal sound it makes, a slightly higher pitch on spin cycle, and you have a note to mention it to your husband over the weekend. These are not worries. They are notes. The notes file themselves away in their particular location in the architecture of your mind, accessible when needed, not requiring attention right now. Right now, there's only the pillow and the dark and the quiet and the slow withdrawal of the day's weight from your body, sinking into mattress, releasing from your shoulders and your feet and your hands, which have been in motion since 5 in the morning, and which now still and become just hands lying on a blanket in the dark, waiting. Sleep comes when it comes, without announcement. One moment the inventory is running, then it isn't. In a few hours, not quite enough hours, the alarm clock will not ring, because you will already be awake before it does. The house will be dark. The coffee basket will be waiting. The floor will be cold. The morning will be exactly where you left it. If you have followed this woman through this particular day, you may have noticed something that resists easy summary. Every single thing she did was done with a level of competence and consistency that most people today reserve for their professional obligations, and then only on their most organized days. She managed the logistics of a household with the precision of a small business operator. She maintained personal presentation standards that required daily effort and genuine skill. She fed her family with care and planning and real physical labor. She participated in community life in ways that mattered to the institution she served. She did all of this without a salary, without formal recognition, and without much of it being visible to the people most immediately benefiting from it. The mythology of the 1950s American housewife has always contained a kind of flattening. She appears in mythology as one of two things: either perfectly cheerful and content, a woman who genuinely wanted nothing more than what she had and found in the domestic sphere every form of fulfillment that a human life requires, or trapped and miserable, a woman whose interior life was a silent scream behind the apron and the pearls. The reality, as with almost all realities involving actual human beings and actual circumstances, was considerably more various than either version allowed for. Some women were genuinely happy. The physical competence involved in running a household well is genuine competence, and the satisfaction of genuine competence is a real and sustaining satisfaction. The sociologist Helena Znaniecki Lopata, whose 1971 study, Occupation, Housewife remains one of the most comprehensive investigations of subjective experience of American housewives in this period. Found women who described their work with real pride and real pleasure, who found in the order and the management and the relationships of domestic life exactly the kind of engagement that matched the shape of their minds and personalities. This was real. This deserved to be taken seriously. Other women were quietly exhausted in ways they did not have the framework to articulate. The rates of depression and anxiety among American housewives in the late 1950s, when researchers began to measure them with some seriousness, were significantly elevated above comparable rates in women who worked outside the home. The tranquilizer Miltown, introduced in 1955, became one of the first prescription drugs in American history to achieve genuine mass market usage, and the primary demographic was women. By 1957, 1 in 20 Americans had tried it. The doctors who prescribed it understood this as a medical intervention for individual symptoms. The researchers who would come afterward would understand it as evidence of a structural problem. Betty Friedan named it in 1963, the problem that has no name, and the phrase carried with it the specific power of language that finally describes something that many people have felt without being able to articulate. The problem was not that domestic life was meaningless. The problem was that being exclusively defined by domestic life, in an era that offered educated women few other definitions, was for many women a cage built of perfectly acceptable materials. But the women themselves in the 1950s specifically mostly did not experience it in those terms. They experienced it as Tuesday's ironing and Wednesday's floors and Thursday's shopping and the children's lunches and the church meeting and the neighbor's coffee and the cold cream before bed. They experienced it as a life, fully occupied and entirely real, organized around values that they largely shared because those were the values that were available to them, and because many of those values, when carefully examined, had genuine worth. The love for children, the satisfaction of a well-run house, the pleasure of a meal well made, the warmth of community, the small daily quiet of a cup of coffee at a kitchen window before anyone else was up. None of these things required the cage to be valuable. They were valuable in themselves. The houses from that era are still there in many American cities and towns. The streets are still there. The elm trees that were planted in the new suburban neighborhoods of the late 1940s are now enormous. Their canopies closing over streets that were once open and new and sunlit, full of the particular energy of a country that had survived something terrible and was determined now to build something good, something safe, something permanent. The women who live these days are elderly now or gone, but they left traces in the recipes clipped from Good Housekeeping and tucked between pages of cookbooks that are now in antique shops or in attics, in the church committee minutes filed in cardboard boxes in parish offices, in the oral history archives where patient historians recorded women talking about their days, their methods, their satisfactions, and their frustrations, with the specificity and the candidacy of people who understood, eventually, that their ordinary lives mattered, in the chemical smell of pledge on a Wednesday morning, in the sound of a pop-up toaster at 7 o'clock, in the weight of a cast iron Dutch oven, and the particular smell of the braise after 3 hours, and the cold cream jar on the bathroom shelf, in the alarm clock that didn't ring because she was already awake. She always was. And if you're still here, still listening, still somewhere comfortable with the lights low and the day put away behind you, then you know what this channel is about. This slow, unhurried companionship with the past. The way history arrives differently when it comes to the specific details of an ordinary life rather than to the large events that fill the textbooks. There were no battles today, no treaties, no famous names. There was a woman who woke up before the alarm in a cold house, who set her hair and did her face and put on her girdle and made breakfast and cleaned floors and went to market and made the pot roast and talked to her neighbors and settled her children and washed the dishes twice and came to bed. And in that one day, repeated in approximately 11 million American households on that particular Tuesday or Wednesday in the mid-1950s, with all its specific texture and all its unremarked competence and all its private satisfactions and all its uncounted hours, there is more history than in most of the events we are normally asked to remember. The morning will take care of itself. It always does. Sleep well. Thank you so much for spending this evening with boring history for sleep. If this episode helped you relax, if it gave you something quiet and interesting to drift towards sleep with, please consider leaving a like. It takes just a moment, and it genuinely helps more people find this channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There are many more of these slow walks through history available, and new episodes arrive regularly. Everyone is made with you in mind. The person who wants history at the pace of a quiet evening rather than the pace of a lecture. Drop a comment if you're so inclined. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Tell me what you'd like to explore next. I read everything you leave there, and the community that is gathered in these comments is genuinely one of the nicest places I've encountered anywhere. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing quiet history over something louder. Good night. Dream of kitchens that smell of pot roast and women who are up before the alarm. You're in good company.